During an emergency meeting on Thursday, members of the United Nations Security Council condemned recent mass killings of civilians in the Sudanese city of Al Fashir by the paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, or R.S.F. A civil war has overtaken the country of Sudan since April 2023, where at least 40,000 people have died and millions have been displaced. But this week's events in Al Fashir has escalated an already devastating and horrific conflict. Here to explain the roots and context of this war is Nisrin Elamin. She's an assistant professor in the African Studies and Anthropology program in the University of Toronto. Good morning, Nisrin.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to get to what happened in Al Fashir in a minute, but I really want to start with some context. This current civil war began in 2023, but you argue that the roots of this conflict goes back to the 1950s. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I say that is that I think we have to understand both the colonial roots of state violence in Sudan. We gained our independence in 1956, and sort of that moment of the formation of the post-colonial state was very much shaped by British colonizers in the sense that we inherited a kind of extractive, export-oriented economy, but also a political system that kind of relied on a system of elite rule, right? And so you had elites from the north and center placed in government essentially to rule over a very diverse, vast country that then enshrine the kind of systemic marginalization of large areas of the country, including Darfur, South Sudan. And so from the very beginning in the 1950s, you had South Sudanese demanding more political representation, of course, development funding and infrastructure, because the South had been purposefully underdeveloped during colonialism. And, you know, those grievances and demands were never met. And so that eventually led to Southern resistance fighters taking up arms. And that was the kind of outbreak of the first civil war in Sudan was actually right before independence. And over the decades, there were two phases to this war. Over 2.5 million South Sudanese were killed. And I think we can't really divorce the current war from this kind of much longer history of state violence in Sudan against, non-Arab communities in the so-called peripheral regions of the country that really facilitated intensified forms of resource extraction, displaced people off their land, and really allowed the elites at the center of the country to hold on to power.
So let's talk more about those divisions that have kind of always existed and perhaps now been exploited, and specifically between these elites, presumably Arab, and then the indigenous Black Sudanese people. Talk to me a little bit more about those divisions.
Sure. I mean, I think the historian Amir Idris talks about a kind of racialized post-colonial state in that these divisions were used by elites to pit people against each other and to facilitate forms of resource extraction and kind of the consolidation of elite power. And so I think we have to think about the ways that race has always been instrumentalized in that way, and the ways that it's facilitated yeah, forms of violence that are extractive always. So it's about making profit and expanding power rather than it being sort of naturalized divisions that exist within society. They've been just mobilized by elites in instrumental ways. I mean, we do have a long history of slavery that also kind of shapes these divisions. But I would say that it's state elites that really took advantage of those divisions in order to consolidate their power and yeah.
So how is that playing out now? Like, who is the RSF, first of all? Like, where do they fit into this division?
Yeah, so the R.S.F. emerged out of a militia known as the Janjaweed that they're made up of Arab pastoralist groups in Darfur who had their own grievances against the state. So I mentioned these divisions, but of course, the Darfur region is very diverse and has always been marginalized and neglected, even in terms of the kinds of, infrastructure and resources that went to the state. And so even pastoralists were marginalized in that process. And of course, with the climate crisis, there was an intensified competition between pastoralists and non-Arab farmers that in the past had usually been resolved through a kind of traditional systems of conflict resolution. But in 2003, the Sudanese government armed the pastoralists against the farming communities in that competition over resources, instead of responding to the grievances of pastoralists for kind of neglect and I think it was also in that moment that armed groups in Darfur who had been demanding more political representation, more development funds and infrastructure, etc., like in the 1950s, right, like Southerners did in the 1950s, that then led to fighting, which was exacerbated or really intensified by the Sudanese government arming the pastoralists and turning them into essentially a wing of the state, right? By using them as a counterinsurgency force against the armed groups, and essentially emboldening them and working in partnership with them to commit genocide in 2003. So
Against these Arab pastoralists were emboldened or enabled to commit genocide against the kind of indigenous
yes,
Black Sudanese population.
yes, against the farming populations, and we saw kind of a something similar to what's happening now, where the Janjaweed in collaboration with the army, with the Sudanese army, wiped out entire villages, killed over 300,000 people and displaced over 2.5 million. And one of the things that's important to understand is that of the people that were displaced during that first genocide, right? It was Darfur was the first genocide of the 21st century. Um, Many of them were displaced to cities like Al Fashir, right? These are farming communities that then had to flee to the cities where they lived in IDP camps until the beginning of this current war. And so they're now experiencing uh, the same type of violence, the same genocidal violence that they experienced in the early 2000s, only this is the second time they're experiencing it.
Just for a point of clarification, when you're saying pastoralists, what does that mean?
I'm talking here about nomadic groups that herd animals. Yeah.
As opposed to the indigenous Black African Sudanese people who are more.
Most of them are, I mean, not all. There's a
Yeah, of course.
Darfur is an extremely
Yeah.
diverse place, and there are, non-Arab pastoralists as well, and
Hmm.
Arab farming communities. But yeah, the division is primary. What I'm describing here is kind of indigenous Darfurians who are farming on their land, and kind of more nomadic Arab identified groups that are pastoralists. And again, I think the question of race is complicated in the case of Sudan, but I do think it's important to emphasize that for, generations and decades, people were living together, peacefully. And even when conflicts arose, those were mediated and resolved through traditional forms of conflict resolution. Often the third group of people or elders would come in and resolve those problems. But the state is really what kind of they're the ones who mobilize those divisions for violent means, right? And in order to consolidate their power and to extract resources.
Um, this is very much portrayed as a civil war. But in January 2024, a UN panel of experts on Sudan submitted a report to the Security Council, which cited, quote unquote, credible allegations that the U.A.E, United Arab Emirates, were providing military supplies to the R.S.F. The U.A.E denies those allegations. What is the role of the United Arab Emirates in Sudan in this moment?
Yeah, so before I answer that, I just want to go back to the question you asked me earlier about the R.S.F. and who they are. So I mentioned that they're these kind of aggrieved ethnic militias that were turned into a kind of counterinsurgency force by the state, who then collaborated with the army to commit genocide in the early 2000s. In 2013, they were then formalized into a militia called the Rapid Support Forces by the al-Bashir regime. Al-Bashir wanted to coup-proof his rule essentially against the army because we've had multiple military coups in Sudan's history.
And
Um,
al-Bashir was?
was the former dictator of Sudan from 1989 until 2018. He was overthrown by a very powerful popular revolution, after 30 years in power. And so in 2014, actually, the European Union further legitimized the Rapid Support Forces by pumping money into the al-Bashir regime, about $200 million, to use them as their border patrol at the border between Sudan and Libya, right, in their efforts to externalize the European Union's border to stem the so-called, the migration of so-called, illegal African migrants, and I put that in quotes because nobody's illegal, into Europe. And so I think it's important that context, the RSF and the army also sent troops to fight in the war on Yemen on the Saudi coalition's behalf. So they've been used as mercenaries elsewhere as well. And so coming back to your point, there is very credible evidence from the UN, from Human Rights Watch, and other agencies that the United Arab Emirates has been arming the Rapid Support Forces from the very beginning of the war. In fact, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, right, we've seen the RSF had held Al-Fashir under siege for 500 days, starving people, trapping them inside the city while cutting off supply lines. And then this week they, you know, basically took over the city, and the army kind of negotiated a withdrawal from the city, leaving about 250,000 people, civilians, trapped inside the city, and escalating their atrocity, their crimes, their genocidal violence against them. We've seen, for example, a maternity hospital, the last standing hospital in Al Fashir. The RSF killed everybody in the hospital. There was about 460 people, right? They've been committing massacres since the takeover, and even before, but that violence has escalated while the heads of the RSF are being wined and dined in Washington, D.C., during these kind of high-level peace negotiations that didn't really go anywhere. And during those peace negotiations, you have the United States, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates essentially play peace brokers, when we know that the United Arab Emirates is probably one of the most harmful external actors in this war. They've been providing the Rapid Support Forces with weapons in exchange for gold, in exchange for Sudanese livestock and gum arabic and other kinds of resources. And so, I think it's important to really highlight the role of the United Arab Emirates in this, because I've seen lots of reports talk about the humanitarian catastrophe, about the genocidal violence that is happening. But unless we really name the perpetrators, which in this case are the RSF in the case of Al Fashir and the United Arab Emirates, and we hold those accountable, things aren't going to change on the ground. And so I think one of the first things that needs to happen is there needs to be pressure on the United Arab Emirates to stop arming the RSF. And that, I think, can only happen through a trades and arms embargo. The United Arab Emirates is one of Canada's main trading partners in the Middle East. And so they could really use their leverage there to get them to stop arming the Rapid Support Forces, instead of uh, legitimizing them by allowing them to kind of cosplay as peace brokers in Washington.
You touched on this, but I want to push it further. Why would the UAE, which is a relatively small Gulf state, be so interested in Sudan, of all places?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I part of my research is on this. I've been looking at the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but primarily the UAE's investments in Sudanese land and ports over the last 20 years. They've invested about $14 billion in Sudanese land and infrastructure. And, a lot of people would frame it as a food security measure, that they're trying to acquire land, especially in parts of the country where there's water. My family's from an area called the Jazeera, which is just south of Khartoum. It's a kind of fertile delta area nestled between the White and Blue Nile, and they've acquired a farm there, for example. But if it were only about food security, we would see them growing things like rice and other things that people eat. But instead, they're mostly cordoning off large tracts of land that cut off grazing routes for herders, and you know um, basically dispossess farmers of access to communal lands that have been used to farm mostly subsistence foods. And they're growing animal feed to essentially bolster their own dairy and meat industries. And those products that they produce in that process then get brought back to places like Sudan and flood rural markets, for example, undermining both local production and the ability of small producers to sell their goods. So I think for me, I look at the UAE as having ambitions around kind of expanding their regional power across the Horn of Africa. They've acquired ports all across the Horn of Africa, including there was a $6 billion port deal that they signed in Eastern Sudan along the Red Sea just before this war broke out. It's now been annulled, but the idea was to kind of link this private Emirati owned port to some of their agricultural projects inland. And if you draw a strategic triangle between the port and these projects that they have inland, it forms a triangle that is larger than the Emirates itself. It's like they wanted to build a kind of private toll road. And to me, I think it's about them trying to control circuits and nodes of production and distribution across the Horn of Africa and to control what comes in and out of the region. It's about intensifying their ability to extract Sudan's rich mineral resources. Um, and, I would I would argue that the Emirates is an emergent imperial or sub-imperial formation, that they're really trying to engage in a form of empire making that is entangled with US empire, but not entirely dependent on it, and sometimes in tension with it, that they're really trying to expand their regional power, and that Sudan plays a very important role in that because of its long Red Sea coast and because of its vast agricultural and mineral resources.
You touched on this again, but I do want to explore further. What do you want to see from the government of Canada in this moment, both politically and perhaps even in terms of accountability when it comes to international law?
Yeah, there was recently a case in the ICC where
Yeah,
top
that's the International Criminal Court, just for listeners. Yeah.
yeah, sorry,
Yeah.
of the International Criminal Court, where Ali Koucheb, who's a well-known genocidaire in the first genocide that we mentioned earlier, is was indicted. And I've been asked this question. Well, first of all, I think this is 20 years later, and part of the reason we're seeing what is happening in Al Fashir and Darfur today is because survivors never got justice, right? And 20 years later, this is kind of too little, too late. And I would say the same goes for Canadian companies like Talisman Energy, like the London Group, who have been implicated in extracting Sudanese resources in exchange for funding to the al-Bashir regime to carry out its counterinsurgency against Southerners, against Darfurians. And so I think we can't think of Canada as a neutral actor here in the sense that their companies have been implicated in state violence in the past. There is a Montreal-based PR firm called Dickens and Madsen, run by an ex-Israeli intelligence officer that represented the Rapid Support Forces after they committed a massacre during the revolutionary sit-in during the 2018-2019 revolution that overthrew Omar al-Bashir. And they have never been brought to justice. And so uh, and that was a key sort of, the PR firm allowed the R.S.F. to expand its international partnerships with the U.A.E, for example, and with Russia. So that is partly why we're having this kind of they have this strong relationship now with the U.A.E. And so I think I would like to see those companies be held accountable legally, financially, morally. I also think that Canada has failed Sudanese Canadians in its immigration policies. There's a family reunification program that started, when the war began, and they kind of expanded the notion of family a little bit to include grandparents, etc. But very few people have actually been reunited with their loved ones. Many of them still stuck in Sudan. Some have died in the process of waiting. And so there's this kind of bureaucratic red tape that is really deadly that needs to be addressed. In terms of a refugee program, while some refugees have been let into Canada, it's at a rate or a ratio of 1 to 100 in comparison to Canada's response to the war in Ukraine. And of course, that is shaped by anti-Black racism, But I think it's also shaped by the fact that Canada doesn't want to face its responsibility in the war in Sudan, past and present. There have also been, for example, Canadian striped armored vehicles that have been, found in Sudan. And so, yeah, I want Canadian listeners to be able to recognize that uh, Canada has played a negative role, not only in Sudan and also in other African countries, through its mining industry. And I think we need to hold those companies accountable. There is a role to be played on the humanitarian aid side. Um, Hundreds and thousands of people have managed to flee from Al Fashir to Tawila, which is not controlled by the R.S.F. or the army, and so is relatively safe. And there are very few humanitarian aid agencies that have set up there. And so there's a huge need for humanitarian aid. Um, and I should mention that it's primarily local emergency response rooms that grew out of the resistance committees that were the backbone of the popular revolution that overthrew al-Bashir that are at the forefronts of relief efforts, and they have been since the beginning of the war, in the kind of face of a barely present international aid community and absent of a functioning state. And so they're essentially running a country in the absence of a state, supporting people to survive despite extreme food shortages and, of course, extreme violence. I mean, the violence that we've been talking about, it's hard for me to even describe. And so I think there is a role for countries like Canada to play in actually funneling humanitarian aid to those local responders who have proven that they're best equipped to respond to people's needs, especially in areas that are still quite dangerous where large international NGOs are either unable or unwilling to operate. Um, so yeah, I think those are some of the things. And I wish, we have a protest here in Toronto. There will be one in Ottawa to draw attention to the atrocities that are currently unfolding in Al Fashir. Um, and I hope that non-Sudanese come out. There hasn't been, whenever we've organized protests, it's mostly Sudanese diaspora folks that show up. And I would love to see more non-Sudanese pay attention to what the UN has called the largest humanitarian and hunger and displacement crisis in the world.
Nisrin, I so appreciate you explaining all of the context behind this. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nisrin Elamin is an assistant professor in African Studies and Anthropology at the University of Toronto.